I have served in Naval Hyperbaric medicine for 21 years. Long enough that my own life has been reduced to a set of controlled routines, like the chambers I tend. Every morning begins the same. I unlock the hyperbaric bay, check the pressure, gauges by hand, and listen for the faint hiss of air slipping through seals. Stainless steel sweats when the temperature shifts against the sea, so I always run my fingers along the seams. The texture is cold, damp, faintly oily with the residue of naval grease. Small details tell me more than any readout. Machines may lie. The body and its environment never do. After gauges, I review the dive logs. The officers who bring men up from impossible depths often scrawl in shorthand, but I mark every anomaly in red ink. Partial decompressions, skipped safety stops, unexplained delays. I have trained myself to see patterns. Headaches forming a chain through different divers, subtle deviations in ascent profiles, a cough that does not belong in a routine log. Every case I treat as a fragment of evidence in an ongoing argument with the ocean itself. The sea takes what it wants, and I exist to prove it can be forced to give back. Discipline is survival out here. The vessel is steel wrapped around fragility, hundreds of men depending on air, pressure, and routine maintenance. In the medical wing, my colleagues joke about my obsession with calibration, how I linger too long with the oxygen sensors or recalibrate flow meters that others would trust. By sight alone, they don't understand. One careless reading, 1 degree off, and lungs rupture like overfilled balloons. My worldview has hardened to a single principle. Nothing is inexplicable. Gas laws, tissue saturation, pressure differentials. These govern life and death beneath the waves. Whenever I am summoned to treat a diver, I tell myself the same mantra. There is always a cause, and if there is a cause, there is a cure. It was in this spirit that I first met Petty Officer Maria Torres. A trauma nurse by training, sharp-eyed and irreverent, she had a habit of keeping pace with my precision while needling my severity. She kept order in the infirmary with brisk efficiency, but beneath her folded uniform, I once noticed the faint outline of a rosary pressed against her pocket. She never spoke of it, but I registered it the way I register everything. Another variable, one that belonged more to faith than to science. At the time, I believed the two could never meet. I believed that until the night the ocean returned, a man whose lungs were filled with ash. They brought him in just before midnight, the deck slick with brine and diesel, the winch still shuddering from the weight it had hauled out of black water. The dive lieutenant spoke in clipped fragments. Signal loss at depth, backup, tether fouled, ascent aborted. And I let the words settle into their proper places the way I sought valves and gauges. Failure at depth is never a single thing, it is a braid of errors. We rolled the gurney under the sickbay lights. He was a broad-shouldered man in a torn dry suit, skin grey with hypothermia and something else. An ashen cast that was not the grey of poor perfusion, but a dusting, as if he had slept beneath a chimney. I noted the first vital signs as a matter of ritual. Pulse thready, blood pressure low, pupils reactive. The mouth hung slightly open. I expected the usual brine at the lips, the bitter sea stink we suction from a drowning airway. Instead, the odour was flat, cold, like a match snuffed out. Suction, I said. Torres handed me the Yankauer tip. When the catheter touched his palate, the tubing did not fog with sputum. It darkened with particulate. Black granules rattled down the line, dry as sand. The sound was grotesquely domestic, like vacuuming a hearth. The trap filled as if we were mining a seam. I signalled for bronchoscopy. For a layman, a bronchoscope is a pencil-thin camera we thread into the trachea to see the branching airways and remove blockages. In a drowning, we look for water and edema. In smoke inhalation, swollen tissues and soot. In this man, The camera found corridors flocked with black powder. The tracheas, pale rings were muffled as if wintered over. When I tried to suction, the grit came away in sheets, delicate as old charcoal. Then the scope's channel clogged, not with mucus smears, it glistens, but with powder that refused to dissolve. I withdrew, flushed, tried again, clogged, again. Contamination? Torres asked, keeping her voice level because that is what training does to fear. Unlikely, I said. Repeat kit. We did. The second line filled the same way. Instruments do fail, but they do not fail in chorus. We move to imaging. In hyperbaric medicine, I trust pictures when I do not trust sound. A chest X-ray should map the lungs as two stormy silhouettes where air moves. Instead, both fields were the chalky opacity of a slate wiped wrong, collapsed, or filled. Yet the heart's silhouette beat with obstinate regularity. I ordered arterial blood gases, ABGs, drawn. For a lay reader, ABGs tell me how much oxygen rides in the blood, how acid or alkaline the body is, whether ventilation is doing its job. The printout spat numbers that did not belong to a living human. Oxygenation near zero. Carbon dioxide not rising as it should in suffocation. In ordinary terms, no fuel going in, no exhaust building up, a silent engine. Doctor, Torres said quietly. The diver's chest rose. The chest rose and fell, rose again, steady as a metronome. No stridor, no ragged pull of a blocked airway. Just movement. I placed my palm on the sternum and felt the lift and return, mechanical and calm, like a bellows that someone else was squeezing out of sight. This is agonal, a corpsman asked, agonal respirations being the useless gasping reflex of a dying brainstem. No, I said, and heard the flatness in my own voice. Agonal is irregular. This is rhythmic. We put a mask over his face out of habit, though habit had lost its jurisdiction. Oxygen flowed. The monitor refused to change its mind. The numbers remained impossible. Here is why they were impossible. For anyone listening who has not spent their life counting breaths, life requires exchange. Oxygen must cross from air to blood across alveoli, the microscopic sacs at the ends of the lungs. When those sacs are collapsed or packed with debris, oxygen cannot cross and the body suffocates. He was packed. He did not suffocate. The crew gathered, pulled by the gravity of something that should not be. A petty officer muttered it was the equipment. Someone else suggested a rare chemical exposure. Another said we should sedate him until we knew what we were seeing. Torres's face had lost its usual impatience. What remained was an efficient fear. She lifted the mask and looked at the film of granules the exhalation had left on the inside. The particles shimmered as if they held heat, then cooled into dull powder. We need isolation, I said. He goes to the chamber. Not because hyperbaric therapy would help, but because the chamber is a sealed room governed by pressure and protocol. My terrain. In a sealed system, you control the variables, and control is how you build a path back to reason. We wheeled him down the corridor, to the bay. The ship's hull sang its quiet iron note. The compressors added their familiar hum. I keyed open the hatch. The metal felt colder than it should, as if the air on the other side were older. Inside, stainless walls curved into a cylinder that has saved men I believed unsavable. The chamber accepts only evidence. It does not care for stories. We transferred him to the inner cot. When I sealed the hatch, the wheel turned under my hand with a damp click, and the room sighed into its own atmosphere. I set the ambient pressure to 1.5 atmospheres, mild, safe. Nothing dramatic, nothing therapeutic, only enough to prove the world still obeyed. He breathed. Ash gathered in the exhalation port like winter on a sill. Behind me, Torres spoke too quickly. The ABG machine's overdue for calibration. The flow meters, we swapped them last week. Sensor bias could... We will test the machines, I said. All of them. I meant it. It is my religion. But there was a honeysuckle quiet in the man's breathing that did not belong to a lab error. The chamber's circular window held my reflection, and beyond it, the divers. Chest rose and fell in strict time. It felt all at once like watching the tide lift a corpse and then let it down again, kinder than hands. I have learned that fear, in adults, rarely announces itself as fear. It arrives as procedure multiplied to absurdity. I checked what did, not need checking. I told Torres to draw repeat gases, to change to a third suction kit, to log every minute. She did. I printed another X-ray. The films, laid side by side, were shadows of the same white-out lungs. The breath continued. It should comfort a physician to find order, even a monstrous order. But standing inside that pressure vessel, forced to admit that gas laws and alveolar diffusion were being set aside like outdated regulations, I felt the first crack in the instrument panel of my mind. I had spent 2 decades proving that the body cannot lie. That night, I learned it could. The chamber had always been my sanctuary. A sealed cylinder of steel and pressure, free from superstition, a place where physiology yielded to mathematics. But as dawn broke over the water and filtered dimly through the portholes in the bay, I stood inside that chamber with a man whose lungs mocked both mathematics and medicine. We began with imaging. In cases of pulmonary trauma, the chest X-ray is the most basic of tools. Our first window. I rolled the portable machine into the bay, its casters rattling on steel plating, and positioned it over the diver. The film developed grainy but clear. I held it to the fluorescent light. Both lung fields were opaque, dense with particulate. Normally, alveoli, those microscopic sacs that take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide, present as dark expanses. Black is life, because black is air. White signals fluid, infection, collapse. This man's lungs were chalked over like blackboards scrubbed with ash. Yet his chest continued to rise and fall, a metronome of mockery. I ordered bronchoscopy next. Torres prepared the scope with silent efficiency. The scope's camera snaked down into the trachea, revealing branching corridors. I narrated for the record. Airways coated with black particulate, non-reflective, friable. Mucosa intact, no hyperemia, no edema. For a layman, the lining of his airways should have been raw, inflamed, angry at the invasion of foreign matter. Instead, they were smooth, almost undisturbed, as if the lungs welcomed their contamination. When I tried suction, the instrument clogged within seconds. Ash resisted extraction, like soil clinging to roots. Torres leaned over my shoulder. "Equipment contamination," she said, her tone crisp but fraying. "That scope's been in storage." I shook my head. We flushed it 3 times. Same result. Same substance. She crossed her arms, the posture of a skeptic shielding herself. Her rosary chain glinted faintly when she shifted. She didn't notice I noticed. We tried tissue sampling. With sterile forceps, I clipped a sliver from the bronchial wall. Under the dissecting microscope, the specimen revealed itself as nothing I could name. Not necrosis, not soot, not carbon. The particles arranged themselves into delicate sheets, like snow pressed into paper, pulsing faintly as if alive. My breath fogged the lens. I adjusted the focus. The ash vibrated under magnification, a tremor so fine it could not have been mechanical artifact. It looked as if the residue was breathing too. I logged every observation, every incongruity, because the act of writing creates the illusion of mastery. But with each note, mastery slipped. I should have been cataloguing pathology. Instead, I was inventorying impossibility. Blood gases came next. I ordered ABGs. Again. Torres drew arterial blood with the practiced stab of someone who has done it 1,000 times. The sample ran through the analyzer, and the machine spat its verdict. Oxygen near zero, carbon dioxide static, pH stubbornly neutral. For those who have not read these values before, life depends on oxygen entering and carbon dioxide leaving. Without exchange, cells suffocate, acids build, the body fails. Here, exchange had ceased, but the body persisted, serene as a sealed engine. It was like watching a car run indefinitely on an empty tank, exhaust pipes cold. Torres read the slip twice, then folded it in her fist. It's wrong. The numbers are correct, I said. The reality is wrong. The diver's chest rose again, steady, rhythmic. The exhalation valve in the chamber released with a sigh, and a faint mist of black particles drifted into the filter. I imagined them lodging in the machinery, infiltrating the compressors, spreading through the ship's ducts. Containment was faltering, if it had ever been real. I leaned back against the chamber wall, condensation cooling through my scrubs. My training demanded analogies to anchor the impossible. It is as if, I said aloud, the man is inhaling shadows. Shadows have no substance, no gas molecules to diffuse, yet here shadows entered his lungs and returned as dust. Saying it out loud helped nothing. We moved to histology. Torres and I slid the ash onto glass slides, sealed them under cover slips, and examined them under standard light microscopy. At 10 times magnification, the particles looked like fractured glass. At 40, they seemed to align, not randomly, but in latticework. Each fragment pointed to another, as if constructing a map too vast for us to perceive. The pattern shifted with every heartbeat. I told myself it was vibration from the compressor, but the chamber was silent except for breath. "Doctor," Torres whispered. I followed her gaze. The diver's chest was no longer random in its rhythm. It had synced to something external, the faint ping of sonar from the ship's hull. Every time the deep pulse reverberated through steel, his lungs rose and fell in time, as if the sea itself was pacing him. That was when unease truly took hold. Because sonar is not breath, it is a signal, a sound sent into water to find the unseen. For his respiration to lock with it suggested he was no longer breathing air or even ash, but sound itself, a physics of the absurd, a physiology that rewrote its own rules. Torres gripped the edge of the microscope table. "This isn't human," I corrected her, because correction is the last bastion of sanity. "It is human, which is why it should be impossible." I replayed every step in my head. Intake, airway, alveoli, blood gases, cellular metabolism. Each link in the chain was intact in theory, broken in practice. My entire career rested on the idea that anomalies have causes. That night, I confronted the possibility that anomalies may also have intentions. The chamber smelled faintly of burnt paper now. The ash had begun to settle on the stainless steel floor, dulling its reflection. I rubbed a line with my shoe. The smear left behind was darker, sticky, like soot mixed with oil. I logged the sensory data, though the act felt hollow. Recording an impossibility does not tether it to reality. The diver's eyelids fluttered. Once, though, he did not wake. His chest lifted in time with sonar, exhaled, and the chamber's vents whispered like distant surf. My pen trembled in my hand, leaving a spatter on the logbook margin. I stared at it for a long time. It looked too much like a constellation. And constellations, I realized, are only patterns we impose to find order in a void. The chamber is designed to isolate men from the ocean's cruelty. Yet by the third night, I realized it was isolating us from nothing at all. I had left the diver sealed inside under constant monitoring. The hyperbaric chamber is built for therapy, controlled oxygen, stable pressure. But in this case, it served as containment. Or so I told myself. The ash had already worked its way into the filters, the air handling system coughing black motes, despite triple filtration. Torres spent hours wiping surfaces with disinfectant wipes that turned grey by the end of each pass. I kept telling her that contamination was manageable, that this was a problem of equipment. My voice was steady, but inside, I knew the equipment was only echoing what the body had already betrayed. The diver still breathed, not shallow, not laboured, but steady, as though each inhalation was commanded by a metronome outside time. I had grown accustomed to watching his chest rise and fall in rhythm with the sonar pulses that rang faintly through the hull. 1.3 seconds between each beat of sound, 1.3 seconds between each rise of his chest. The synchronization was precise enough to clock by. I had been dictating into the logbook when the first whisper occurred. It came during exhalation, when the body is meant to surrender carbon dioxide and draw relief from release. Instead, the vent valve carried with it a thin voice, brittle as the rasp of sandpaper. I already drowned. The words were so faint I doubted them at first, a pattern-seeking brain latching on to noise. But Torres stiffened where she stood, latex gloves in hand, and dropped the cloth she'd been using. We froze together, the chamber's pressure gauge ticking faintly in the silence after. "Repeat the exhalation sample," I ordered, too quickly. My own words cracked like brittle glass. She replaced the filter with hands that trembled despite her training. Again, the chest rose, fell. Ash hissed into the valve. Again, that same phrase rode the breath, less like speech than the memory of speech burned into residue. I already drowned. The crew had gathered outside the chamber by then, drawn by something they could not name. I saw their faces through the porthole, pale, distorted by thick glass. Sailors accustomed to blood and trauma, but not to this. One muttered that the man should be sedated. Another that we ought to commit him to the deep. Men of steel, whispering burial. Torres broke rank then. For weeks, she had been the skeptic, the one to accuse our machines of failure, to demand recalibration, to call the anomaly contamination. Now she reached into her pocket and clutched her rosary so tightly I saw the cord bite into her palm. Her lips moved without sound. When she looked at me again, there was no skepticism left, only naked fear. I forced my eyes back to the diver. His lips did not move, but the ash vented with each phrase, forming dark tendrils in the air before collapsing to dust. The recorder picked it up, faint but distinct. When I played it back on loop, the words blurred into rhythm until they almost aligned with the sonar pings. A confession set to the sea's own heartbeat. I tried to steady myself with science. Speech requires airflow modulated by vocal cords. This man's cords had not vibrated. His exhalation was particulate, not gaseous. Sound should not have formed at all. And yet the recorder captured syllables. I explained this aloud, for the benefit of the sailors staring in, for Torres clutching her beads, but mostly for myself. My explanation tasted like ash on my tongue. The chamber grew harder to endure as hours passed. The ash accumulated despite filtration, creeping into seams of the floor. The air smelled perpetually of char, like a library burned down long ago. I scrubbed my hands until the skin cracked, yet black dust lingered beneath my nails. At night, I began to dream. In my sleep, I was back inside the chamber, the hatch sealed, no crew outside, no Torres beside me, only the diver and I. His chest rose with sonar, and I felt my own chest rise in time. When he exhaled, ash poured from my own mouth. I woke gasping, my pillow streaked with grey. I told myself it was lint, residue, imagination. But when I coughed into a tissue, the smear on white cotton was undeniable. I feared then that the diver was consuming not only his own deaths, but others. that in drawing breath from drowned futures, he was also pulling from mine. The thought did not belong to reason, but it grew in me like a tumor. Every time I entered the chamber, my lungs felt heavier. Torres admitted, in a whisper meant for no one else, that she too had dreamt of suffocation. She said she woke with the taste of ashes, her mouth dry, her chest aching as though pressurized. She begged me to stop the investigation, to transfer the body, or what passed for a body, back to the ocean. But protocol held me prisoner. My duty is to solve anomalies, not surrender them. By the fourth day, the whispers had grown clearer. They no longer stuttered the same phrase, but wandered into fragments. Already drowned. Not once. Every time. I recorded each syllable, catalogued them, transcribed them into my log, but my handwriting deteriorated, letters skewing into jagged lines. My mind wanted a pattern, but patterns became labyrinths. The chamber itself seemed to respond. The walls resonated faintly with each exhalation, the steel trembling as if struck from within. The gauges quivered, though pressure remained constant. Even the ship's hull seemed to carry the sound. A vibration felt more than heard. Sailors swore they heard breathing in the vents at night. I dismissed their fears aloud, but inside, I felt them too. Breathing where no lungs existed. And yet, I could not look away. Each impossible whisper dragged me deeper. Each ash-stained exhalation tore further into my certainty. That night, when I left the bay, the corridor hummed with the same resonance I had heard in the chamber. I pressed my hand against the bulkhead, and the steel was warm. For the first time in my life, I feared the ship itself was breathing. I wrote in my logbook before sleep, "If he has already drowned, then what is it he draws now? And if the ash is the residue of his collapsed futures, how many must collapse before ours does too?" The answer waited in the chamber, and I knew I would return. By the fifth day, the chamber was no longer a room. It was a throat, and we were inside it. The air held perpetual grit, each breath scratching the nose and throat. Torres wore an N95 mask now, though she confessed it made no difference. Black dust still lined her nostrils. Filters we changed hourly, clogged in minutes. Yet the diver's chest rose with each sonar pulse, a tide of breath against logic. He should have been long dead. Instead, he had become the metronome of the ship. I told myself I would not enter again. The observation through glass was enough. But protocol is a trap disguised as discipline. To stop observing would be to yield. And so, I sealed the hatch behind me once more. The diver lay motionless except for that obscene rhythm, his chest swelling with invisible substance, his lips closed but venting whispers with every sigh. I set the chamber to standby pressure, 1.0 atmospheres, neutral, controlled. The gauges steadied, but the walls still trembled faintly, as though the chamber had developed a pulse of its own. I brought ash samples to the lab, seeking a final answer. Under the electron microscope, the particles betrayed themselves as no earthly soot. They formed lattices, crystalline but unstable, collapsing and reforming with each oscillation. Each structure resembled the branching of alveoli, then snapped into shards, then spread into fractals again. The longer I observed, the more I realized they were not random. They were states, not material at all, but fossils of collapsed possibilities. Imagine, for a layman, a deck of cards shuffled and spread. You see one hand, but all others still exist in theory. These particles were the hands that never happened. Collapsed timelines, burned out futures, condensed into residue. The diver was exhaling them, spewing the dust of extinguished lives. Torres stood beside me, silent, her hands trembling at her sides. "He's eating death," she whispered, not as a metaphor, but as diagnosis. I did not correct her. I could not. I returned to the chamber with the slides still cooling under the scope lamp. I demanded answers, not from the sailors, not from Torres, but from the impossible man himself. "Do you understand me?" I asked through the intercom. My voice echoed oddly in the steel. His eyes opened. For the first time since his recovery, pupils fixed on me with terrible lucidity. "Infinite drownings," he said. The voice was a hiss carried by ash, but the syllables were crisp. "I have drowned. Every way a man can drown." The chamber air vibrated with his confession. I steadied myself against the wall, the metal warm under my palm. "What sustains you?" I asked. "What keeps you alive when blood gases are null?" "I do not live," he said. "I only breathe the deaths not yet taken." Science rebelled, inside me. Respiration requires exchange across alveoli, hemoglobin binding oxygen, mitochondria consuming fuel. But here, respiration was theft from futures. Every impossible exhalation collapsed a possibility, leaving behind ash like burnt pages. The horror escalated in two directions at once. Scientific. The chamber filled faster now, black motes swirling until they dulled the steel walls. The filtration alarms screamed as the compressors choked. Ash poured like snowfall. Personal. I realized my profession, my faith in preservation, of breath under pressure, was null. I had spent 2 decades keeping men alive by controlling physics. Here was physics dissolving in my hands. Torres broke. She tore off her mask and slammed her palm on the hatch wheel. "We end it now," she shouted. "We open to the sea. We let it take him back." Her eyes were wild, and the rosary snapped in her clenched fist. I caught her wrist. "If we breach containment..." "Containment is a lie," she spat. "It's already out. You feel it." "I feel it. He's breathing through us." She was right. My chest had been rising in time with his for hours. Each sonar ping drew my lungs upward. Each exhalation left grit on my tongue. He was consuming us too. The diver's body convulsed. His chest heaved in rapid succession, as though the sea itself demanded climax. Black ash poured from his nostrils, his mouth venting like volcanic smoke. He did not choke. He exhaled in one continuous stream, lungs collapsing inward like bellows wrung dry. His ribs pressed against skin, chest hollowing as if folding into itself. Still, he drew breath. His last words came as the chamber lights dimmed, ash clogging every vent. "Someone must keep breathing." Then the seals rattled violently, steel groaning like hull plates under crushed depth. The lights flickered to black. For a moment, ash swirled with its own illumination, storm clouds alive with static. I thought the ship itself would implode. And then, silence. Collapse. The storm of particles fell still, blanketing the chamber in a mat shroud. The diver lay skeletal, chest sunken, body dusted in his own residue. No rise, no fall. The sonar still pinged, but for the first time in days, it found no echo in him. Torres slid down the wall, sobbing into her grey-stained hands. I stood, too numb for collapse, staring at a corpse that had never obeyed life. My instruments were useless, my notes were lies, my discipline had been stripped bare, and the chamber, still vibrating faintly, seemed to breathe without him. When the lights returned, the chamber was a tomb. The diver lay where the storm of ash had buried him in a thin, even snowfall, as if the room itself had decided to keep him. I stood very still and listened for the old rhythm, rise, fall, rise, and found only the mechanical respiration of the ship. Compressors cycling, coolant lines ticking as they cooled, the sonar's distant metronome tapping the hull like a blind man's cane. The chamber no longer answered. Protocol revived me. I cycled the pressure down to ambient 1.0 atmospheres, normal sea level equivalent, and documented the sequence. Depressurization complete. Subject asystolic. No spontaneous ventilation. I opened the hatch. The wheel turned under my palm with a stickiness I had not felt before, as though grease had thickened into grime. When the seal broke, a sigh of stale air slipped past me and carried the odor of a library that had burned and then cooled. We bagged the body with a care that felt ceremonial rather than medical. Torres worked without speech, eyes swollen and red, face veiled by a film of grey that refused to wash clean. A corpsman asked whether we should suction residual particulate from the cot. I told him to leave it until photography was complete. The word residual sounded civilized and therefore untrue. The official report required clarity that the event did not possess. I wrote anyway. Classification. Pulmonary contamination. Etiology undetermined. I listed the imaging, the serial ABGs, the bronchoscopy notes. Where a layman might have expected a confession, the document demanded only sequence and measurement. I supplied them. I avoided phrases that would invite audit, impossible, inexplicable, recursive. In their place, aberrant respiratory motion without corresponding gas exchange, followed by a parenthetical for non-specialists, visible chest rise without oxygen entering the blood, because the form requires a plain language note. I kept the numbers clean, the margins sparse, the tones sterile. Between the lines lay what I had learned and could not write. That breath had been drawn from outcomes that should have remained unborn, and the ash under our nails was the sediment of futures we will not live. I finished before dawn. The printer delivered my pages with a heat that felt absurdly like life. Torres stood in the doorway with a sealed evidence pouch. Inside was her rosary, snapped at the moment the chamber had thundered. She set it on my desk, as if returning, a borrowed instrument. "I'm done," she said. I waited for the rest, done with the shift, done until sleep, done until refit. But her voice had the flatness of a statement already lived through. She meant done with the ship, done with the bay, done with whatever part of herself believed that breath was a promise we could keep. "You'll file?" I asked. "Because forms are the last habits to die." "I'll file," she said. "And then I'll sign out." She didn't ask for my blessing. Resignations are not medical acts. They do not require a counter-signature. Still, I felt complicit. I had courted reason to the edge of a cliff and asked her to lean over with me. "Maria," I said, the first time I had used her given name aboard this vessel, "you were right about one thing." She lifted tired eyes. "Containment," I said. "It was never true." Her mouth trembled once, and she nodded. Then she left the pouch on the desk, turned, and walked out. The hatch shut softly behind her, and the sound of its latch was gentler than a farewell should be. I delivered the body to cold storage with procedural reverence. The morgue refrigerator thumped, settled, hummed, a domestic sound that felt obscene. Condensation beaded on the steel racks. I labelled the drawer. The pen skipped over a fleck of black under my thumbnail and left a stutter in the letter P of Patel. I washed my hands for the third time in 10 minutes. Ash remained, fine as regret. I used a nail brush until blood pinked the water. Flecks still clung in the half-moons like filings pulled by a magnet inside my skin. Sleep did not wait for me. It hid. I lay in the physician's berth and listened to the ship's vascular sounds, pumps, fans, the long inhale of intake and the shorter exhale of exhaust, and realized I had learned a dangerous intimacy. Every machine was a lung if you listened long enough. I tried to anchor myself with basics. Alveoli, the tiny sacs where air meets blood. Hemoglobin, the protein that ferries oxygen like taxis ferry passengers. Diffusion. Motion from higher concentration to lower, like perfume spreading through a room. Simple, stable concepts, explained to recruits and families and court-martials. I repeated them like prayers. The repetition felt like lying to a child. I must have slept. I woke to the sonar. In dreams, its ping does not sound but arrives, a pressure change harvested by the bones. This time, I rose with it, an involuntary matching the way newborns match, a mother's breath. I sat on the edge of the bunk, fingers pressed to my sternum, and counted. 1 ping, 1 lift, 1 ping, 1 fall. The body is a loyal animal. Teach it a rhythm, and it will keep it long after the music stops. Morning rounds felt theatrical. I checked gauges that did not need checking, initialed logs no one would read, and recalibrated devices that had not shifted. The bay smelled faintly of citrus disinfectant, an optimism that could not touch the black grit still caked in the corners where mop heads never reach. The chamber windows reflected my face and, layered over it, the dull grey smear of the room behind me. For a moment, the image made a simple argument. Perhaps this was soot. Perhaps we had all inhaled a story, and exhaled superstition. I nearly believed it until the sonar tapped the hull, and my chest answered like a well-trained crewman. I carried the report to the commanding officer. He read it with the neutral concentration of a man passing weather, initialed the last page, and said what they always say when medicine hands the ocean back to command. We proceed. Orders would move. The ship would sail. The world recorded continues. Back in my cabin, I began a second document, not a report. A confession written in the same narrow hand I use for medication orders and oxygen tables. I did not intend to send it anywhere. Its audience was the part of me that still believed in causes. I cannot reconcile what I witnessed with any mechanism of respiration, I wrote. The subject maintained ventilatory motion without gas exchange, consuming what appeared to be temporal residue, drowned futures, expelled as particulate ash. If this description reads like metaphor, it is only because language was built for causes, not for thefts across time. I paused, then added a line for anyone who would ever read my notes without a degree. He breathed by borrowing the deaths that had not yet happened. The simplicity of it made me sick. I closed the notebook and stared at my hands. The crescents of dirt were still there, though dirt was not the word. I scraped one with a thumbnail, and the smear on the page was matte, not glossy, like graphite without the shine. I lifted the paper and blew gently. A little cloud rose, swirled, and settled in a pattern that looked, for an instant, like alveoli branching toward nothing. Night returned. The ship moved through black water with the calm of a sleeping animal. In the medical wing, the refrigerators hummed. In the chamber bay, the steel remembered what pressure felt like and resented its loss. I stood alone beside the porthole and waited, knowing what I would hear and pretending surprise. The sonar pinged. Somewhere in the ductwork, air shifted. In my chest, the old reflex answered. I have kept men alive in impossible depths by teaching their bodies to obey laws older than language. I believed those laws were permanent. Now I know they are customs the world keeps until something older demands otherwise. I filed the resignation. The form asked for reason. I wrote medical fatigue. It asked for duration. I wrote immediate. I left the notebook in my locker and the official report in the system where reports go to be read and forgotten. I walked the corridor. Once more, palm grazing the bulkhead, feeling for breath where metal should have been mute. I still hear it at night, the faint respirations that match the sonar's pulse. I tell myself it is the ship. I tell myself many things. The ash under my fingernails never fully washed away. For 21 years I kept men alive in impossible depths. But the sea taught me this. It is not life we breathe, but the deaths we have not yet taken.